Welcome back to the Mercy Cast, where we're learning the art of compassion through the adversity of life. I'm your host, Raleigh Sadler. Before we start, I want to tell you about our bonus podcast, More Mercy. This is where I dive deeper into each week's episode and pull things out, bring things up that may have not made it into the final cut. It's $3 a month. This is one great way to support the Mercy Cast. So if you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing. With that said, now let's get into it. Unless you've been living under a rock for the past couple of years, you know about the Enneagram. You may not know what the Enneagram is, but you've heard people talk about the Enneagram, especially people in Christian circles. You'll always hear people talking about their Enneagram number. And it's almost, some people kind of see it as a status, but there's something I think that's very important about why people are getting excited about their Enneagram number, because it's aiding them in self-awareness. They're able to understand how they tick. And as they understand how they tick, they know how to care for others. Now, where this gets toxic is when we see someone and we say, we're not going to hang out because my Enneagram number and your Enneagram number don't match. That's where it gets a little weird, where you start kind of using it as a litmus test to figure out who you want to spend time with and who you don't. But it can be very helpful for understanding how you work. I mean, really, the majority of my life, I've hated personality tests. I have done everything I can to run from them. But I remember a relationship ending and I was like, you know what? I'm going to try the Enneagram. And it was just like scales fell from my eyes. All of a sudden, I know kind of how I tick. I showed it to a couple of mentors and coaches and they're like, yeah, this is exactly who you are. I'm like, great, awesome. So today we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the Enneagram. Christa was in her late 20s and she was running too hard and fast. She was spinning too many plates. And she realized that if something didn't change, everything was going to fall apart for her. Today, I'm joined by Christa Harden. She's a relationship coach, a podcast host, and the author of The Enneagram in Marriage. Christa, welcome to the Mercy Cast.
Thank you so much for having me, Raleigh. That was awesome to hear you talk about how, yes, the Enneagram has gone through so many iterations in your own life and personality tests. And I love how you're coming to that place of just wanting to be known and also being known and how delightful that's been. So thank you for having me.
No, thank you. And I think that is something that's key to why people do the Enneagram in the first place, right? We want to know ourselves, but we also want to be known.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes we don't want to be known in the hard spots.
No. And as a relationship coach, I would assume that this is a big bulk of your job is helping people know and be known in the context of relationship.
It is. And I have to remember what you talk a lot about here on this podcast, compassion, because when I talk to couples, for instance, even right before we got on this call, I was talking to a couple and it's so raw and vulnerable to share who you are and your personality type. And I always just have to hold that so sacred when people are talking and not as a judgmental lens, because it's already a very raw space. Like you said, just being known at all. So it is part of my work, but it's a part that we really have to hold with a lot of love and grace, even as we're trying to shift them. And when I do my work too, I'm trying to do that very same thing, as not hold it with shame, but with a sense of like, okay, this isn't healthy. If we're not in a healthy spot, let's move forward.
I think one of the reasons that we resist vulnerability and resist being known is because we don't want to be controlled. We don't want to be put in a box. Well, now you know me. And so now you're just going to say, well, that's just classic Raleigh. That's what he always does.
Yes.
Raleigh doing Raleigh things, or Christa doing Christa things. That's just what they do.
Yes.
Rather than see the person as a human who is dynamic and capable and not easily thrown into a box.
Yeah, that is a much more well-rounded way to view each other, even when we find our Enneagram type. And it's so helpful to also realize sometimes we have high measures in several of the types so that we can even be a bit more expansive. But as you and I know, and as you said, it's also helpful to have that awareness for where we are dealing with a vice and where we are rubbing up against probably everybody we know in an unhealthy way so that we can shift a bit. So it's such a both and, such that paradox, right?
Well, Christa, that is refreshing what you just said, because a lot of people, they'll be like, here's your number and this is what you are. But when I did my test, I had high scores as a 6, also high scores as a 7. And I know you have your different wings. I'm a 6 that is known as the loyalist. Oftentimes we deal with fear about making decisions, which can be paralyzing. But 7s are kind of, they're out there, they're freewheeling a little bit. They are just moving and they're getting things done and exploring. And honestly, maybe it's just my 7 wing, but that has been coming out a lot in the last couple of years. And so it's like, I have both of these and it just depends on the day which one I'm living out of. Is that normal?
Yeah, you said that well. And because 6 sits right in the center of thinking triad work, if somebody was to know their Enneagram on a little bit of a deeper level, they might say, oh, I'm looking at just the diagram of where 6 and 7 are, like you said, near each other, might be a wing thing, just the parts next to us. But you also named that it's a close temperament type. So it's like as if you had it on a continuum and a trait finder, you'd say, 60% versus 70% of something. And so that's why I think you're finding yourself at that space between, or even shifting back and forth on different days when you have more energy and you're more joyful and moving really fast versus a day when you're a bit more careful and in your troubleshooting. So it's nice to be able to see yourself a bit more expansively. I'm glad you're doing that.
Well, and you talk about the triad. This would be I'm a 6, but in unhealth, I would be a 3. And then in growing in health, I'd be a 9. Is that what you mean by triad?
There are different groupings in the Enneagram. There's wings, arrows, and these groupings of 3 called triads. And so you named arrows because there are not just your type, but these wings around you. So if you're an Enneagram 3, then you've got a 2 and a 4 wing, but you also have some arrows. And then for you, you're a 6 and you have some 5 and some 7. And you also have arrows, as you mentioned, to 3 and to 9. And what that means is, once again, we're brought back to that one point that although 6 may be your main space, it's almost like you have these other pistons working in tandem with your type. And we named 5 types right there for you. So there's probably 4 types that you're not as closely affiliated with. And that's kind of interesting too, to say, what are his tracks? What is he going to look like when he's healthy and not as healthy? And what might be pieces that he doesn't even pick up as much at all? And often we find our partners in those pieces. So not always, but often we are just trying to grow and learn, like, how does the rest of the world work? Because I have my track.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you found your track when everything was falling apart. Describe how that change came to be.
Yeah, great question. It's kind of 2 parts. The first part is I didn't have a name for it yet. When I first started, for those who know the type 7 personality, moving so fast, doing everything all at once, like you said. And I really thought that was the way to win, the Nike, just do it. And I remember thinking of myself as a human science experiment and saying, very logically, if I push a little harder, because this is the Gen X, late Gen X, early millennial kind of mantra that was going for my childhood, then this is it. Push past the headaches, the body senses, the senses that tell you need to slow down and just keep going. And it worked till about, like I said, late 20s, early 30s. I was running a private practice of my own with a lot of teen girls that were cutting themselves. I had 2 toddler daughters that were tantruming really badly and fighting and learning how to have a sister. And then I also had a marriage. On top of that, my husband was starting medical school, and it was too much. I was acting as the clinical director as well. So all of that to say, I fell apart one night in a family session of doing family work with with a mom and her two daughters. And it was a very quiet falling apart because I'm a 7 who wasn't going to ask anyone else to carry that burden. But I came home that night, literally got an ambulance ride for myself after checking on my daughters and husband. And he was probably like, "What? You're okay to call an ambulance? Why are you going in?" But it was this sense of like doom. And later I found out it was mainly panic and overwhelm. And so it was really several trips to the hospital after that to figure out what's going on with me. And there never really was a good answer until I had an integrative medical provider say, take some time just to slow down, just to eat a bit cleaner, to kind of, allow yourself to be in this season where you're super, busy, but yet you're pulling back. So I did everything I could to give another contracted therapist a lot of my caseload as the manager. And I slipped out gracefully for a little while from even doing any therapy. And it was really good to heal me. So that's the first part, is I just had to notice, wow, this personality is getting on top of me and it's causing sheer anxiety. And I have to slow down now. And all of my plans did not work to keep going. So that's when I first learned even the self-care I was teaching my clients for me had to be a slower version of self-care. I'm not an Enneagram 8 who can power through as much. Even 8s need their rest. But then the second piece came later when I actually learned the Enneagram. And that just was a time when I had already learned those practices, but now I had to learn how to negotiate that with my husband. So when I learned the Enneagram, it gave me that experience of, okay, I know my stuff, but now I know his too, and we can work on his stuff as well as mine. And so it was just a clearer roadmap for us as a couple to do that piece.
And so why the Enneagram and not one of the other million personality inventories out there?
That's such a good question, Raleigh. And I actually was a clinical assessor. I was the one who everyone said, give her all the assessments. She loves thinking and doing everything. So I would be the one to get and do the $1,000 of assessments and just take MMPI and give people the Myers-Briggs and the TAT and whatever else. And then I would come up with this prescriptive plan for them that was many pages long. And that was the best we could do back then. And when a therapist friend told me, did you ever take the Enneagram? And she was a type 4, a very deep, really good, gifted therapist, one of my best friends. I said, I took it briefly, moved past it, didn't seem as good as anything else I took. She said, give it a second look. I think you're going to really love it. At the time, she was at Willow Creek and she was like, this is 10 years back almost. And she's like, just let it sit for a minute. And I did. Because of course I'm still a type 7 who still moves quickly through the world. And I never looked away because of this compassion it gave for my spouse and I toward each other. And it named everything I'd gone through that I mentioned earlier. And so I started working on it right away with a couple. I let them know I'm new at this part. Let's try it out on a very difficult issue they were experiencing with infidelity. And sure enough, it worked so well to get to the root of their issues too, quickly. Not a miracle cure. We still had to walk through the steps, but many times you need somebody who's really good at assessing. And even when you have that otherwise, it takes a long time. And it's just a nice shortcut to getting to get yourselves on the right roadmap, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It does. And so now you are this professional assessor. Now you're looking at it through the lens of the Enneagram. You're assessing yourself and you're looking at your marriage saying, okay, now let's both do this. Yeah. Was your husband, did he drag his feet a little bit or was he like, let's go, let's figure it out. Let's figure out how we tick?
He did a little of both. He is very high in masculinity, type 1. And he was like, oh my gosh, like, this is one more thing you're going to give me, right? I'm like, yes, honey. And so it was kind of some of that tongue in cheek, like, I'll do it for you. And then when he experienced at the time, people have become a little bit more healthy with the names that some of these types get, but he was called the perfectionist as soon as he took the test. It just said the perfectionist. And he just like on the screen, it just named it. And that's him at a low state, but it's not him at a high space when he would be more of the improver. And so he pushed the computer away viscerally and he just goes, I'm a perfectionist. he kind of didn't like that. You know, he was like, wait, what? You're just like nailing me on my worst traits here. So he wasn't a fan at first. Then when we got into Ian Cron and Suzanne Stabile's book, which was very popular at the time, it still is, he loved the type 1 explanation, especially the very neat, orderly checklist. And he just was so happy with that checklist. He was like, I love this. Yeah, this is me, all the best and the worst. So it was kind of a cute way to fall into, yeah, they nailed it. And they can also come with a bit more grace than that first test he took.
Well, and I think that's where it can aid self-awareness, because sometimes when we first see our Enneagram number, we just run to the worst explanation. We're like, oh no, I'm a terrible person. Look at me. I'm this or I'm that. And it's rather than say, like, I love how Ian Cron and Susan do that, because they showcase the goods and the things that we can work on. And I think that's what self-awareness is about. It's being aware of what you're doing well, also what you're not doing well, and what you're not doing, just seeing yourself as you are. And that's where I've found the Enneagram to be helpful, because you don't love hearing that, but that's just the first step. That's that moment where you're first seeing yourself and you're like, ugh, I don't like what I see, but you can't change unless you see it.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's like, we don't want to see it. We want to be told everything's going fine. You're fine. You're perfect. But no, like, life is life. And so you both saw yourselves through this lens and you're like, okay, this is me. And I love that story about your husband, how he gets to the checklist and he is just excited. I mean, you did say he's an Enneagram 1, so that just cracks me up. He's just like, oh, this is perfect. I love this.
Yeah. He's like, who did this? It's all on one page. It's so neat. So he was able to see the good of himself too, which, as we, for those who are familiar with Enneagram, and we already said, perfectionist 1, he's, already got a strong inner critic. So to be able to give something life-giving, to sandwich that in with the growth work, is absolutely imperative. But I had to do mine too, which was hard too, because I had sort of thought, oh yeah, I've got to slow down. But seeing my stuff, like you said, was like opening my mail too for the first time. When we come at our marriages with these fundamental attribution errors, like I'm the a little bit healthier one. I'm the one who I thought, here, I'm the marriage specialist. I've got this nailed. And instead I had to see, oh, you bring a lot of issues too. And that was very humbling for me and for Wes both. So that was good for us.
And so as you guys started leaning into your Enneagrams, how did this shift things in your marriage?
Well, we had a decent marriage to a good marriage. We were always that kind of couple who got a lot of attention for being a good couple, but people didn't see the ways we would rub each other behind the scenes. So, I mean, from the time we were high schoolers, voted cutest couple, to, what now we're in our 10th, 11th, 12th year of marriage, we're like, okay, we're doing okay, but like we have, again, kids, big jobs, stress, personalities rubbing, we kept ourselves afloat. And I recommend this to everyone, by date nights every week, once in a while, a little getaway. But even those were becoming less frequent. And so what really helped was us saying, oh my gosh, like, I have gifts and struggles that I didn't even know that we could start looking at in our marriage. And so do you. So I can start celebrating Wes instead of just kind of being irritated that he's orderly to the point sometimes ad nauseum. And he could start realizing she's joyful. And that's such a gift to me. So what we had been doing, as you heard, was sort of looking at our gifts as the best and looking at their failings as hard and maybe irreparable. And now we were able to go, yeah, they have those failings. And I'm glad I could see this here, that I'm not crazy. I knew they had that, but I can also see mine. And we can start to celebrate the good we both bring. And I think that was what really helped us as a catalyst, was to, and continues to help us, is to say, I can work on my garbage and do that with grace, but I can also celebrate what we already are together and how far we've already come. And that's just what every healthy couple does, even if they don't use the Enneagram, is they know the flaws, but they also are able to talk about them with grace, and they have healthy internal narratives about all of it. And so that's really what we began to do. And this tool helped us to nuance that.
Well, yeah. And it changes your perspective, because I feel like when we focus on the negative in our relationships with others, it's just going to beget more negativity rather than, just thinking about the negative all the time is not going to create positive situations for ourselves unless we say, okay, this has to change and I want to focus on this. But sometimes just getting stuck in that spiral or that loop, it's not healthy. And so I love how you're able to see the positives and you describe it as the garbage, the things to work on. Yeah. But you're able to move forward because now you're shifting to more of a positive focus, it sounds like.
Yes. And positivity is very important to a marriage and to brain health. And so even though it's not always intuitive, even for me as a 7, we all have arrows and wings, in other words, we all need that reminder that coming into our marriages with the realism, but also a bit of idealism is very healthy and good for us to be able to look at each other with these grateful eyes every single day and to say, yes, I already know your flaws too. And I love you despite those flaws. And I hope we can support each other for working on our flaws so that we don't just say content to always be in the lowest spaces. But sometimes we do see ourselves in each other in the lowest spaces. And every couple has to work that out too. How do you notice that he can be a perfectionist and I can be gluttonous in activity? How do you gracefully stop that? And that's a process that I've tried to really highlight in my book of here's a little roadmap for everybody because we're all going to have to do that a little bit differently with all of our nuances.
Well, and I think that is one of the best things about your book is that you are giving people a roadmap for how to view the Enneagram in their marriages, because we're all, we'll take the test and then we kind of apply it, but we almost need a guide to say, okay, like, here's the best way to apply it with other people. Yeah. Because if not, it will get messy.
Yeah. Exactly. Just like all my assessments for people, just to have this space where you can just have, I think it's less than a page of, okay, this is the trajectory we expect to see at the beginning of your relationship when you're starting to confront issues and when you're starting to immerse and even rise up out of those issues. Here's some of the work you can be doing. And here's some of the work you look like when you're at your higher space or at your less functional place. So I really try to give people some touch points so that they can see what Wes and I couldn't see, which was our issues, our own issues. We could clearly see each other's, but about ours too, to say, oh, here I am. And it says here that, for instance, in the part of the book where I talk about the 7 functioning on a low level, I talk about them running really hard without recourse, just keeping going, not looking back, not doing their emotional work, not slowing down and hitting a wall. And I know that story. And I've been so privileged to hear the stories from each of the types and depths over many years and months. So it's become important for all of us that have enjoyed Enneagram to sort of look at that and say, oh, I thought that was me healthy. That's actually me super unhealthy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I tell people there was a season in my life where I was ridiculously productive. I was getting so much done. And I believe now, as I look back, I was working out of my 3. I was doing the high achieving thing and I was getting things done, but I wasn't sleeping much. I was working way too many hours a week. And I'll never forget a friend reaching out and saying, hey, I love all that you're doing. I love everything I'm reading and seeing. That's great. I want to see you do this for 20 years and not just 2.
Yes. Ooh, that's
and it was
good.
Yeah. And it was a challenge because then as I started seeing myself and seeing, oh, well, I was in unhealth, even though no one really recognized it by and large, I can look back now and be like, no, I was just pushing myself. So I think it's important for us to use whatever tool we need to be able to understand how we tick and how we interact with others, especially in those close relationships. But not everyone is a big fan of the Enneagram right now. Especially some major Christian leaders have come out and said the Enneagram is bad or it it comes from satanic origins or, what have you. I've heard so many things. And at the end of the day, how do you respond to that when someone says, well, you showcase the Enneagram in your work and in your book? What are your thoughts on what people are saying right now?
As a type 7, I really wouldn't have chosen to enter into the space at the time knowing there was going to be arguments because I'm not like a justice powered 8, 9, or 1 who's like, let's go, big, huge oak energy. I'm more of a problem solver. So I find it sort of annoying that I have to explain now because I'm like, it's such a good tool, but it's also good for me as a spiritual practice to make sure that what I'm doing is ethical. And I did take those good solid looks and watch the videos and listen to the talks and the arguments on both sides. And my husband and I had fun with that. He has a philosophy background too. And we even have a nice FAQ page on our website now and have done podcasts together on this topic. At the end of the day, we really don't want people to fall into that genetic fallacy of dealing with just looking at something's truth by who said it, because all truth is God's truth. And we know that there are people that, maybe psychologists that have done some beautiful work on personality also, and maybe we wouldn't want to follow them as a faith leader, but we would love that they have helped us to understand depression or, form this drug for us if we need it for diabetes. And so we don't want to just say, all people who create anything in the medical or psychological field have to be followers of Christ who are perfect. I don't think we'd have anything if we did that. But for us to really look at ourselves and see what our own convictions are, that's important. So it is okay if people want to use other measures. I would just caution people, don't forget to look at your stuff too, because that's what personality tests do at their best, is they help you to look not just at your best, but at the things that you need to change about yourself. And those are really hard for us to see just because, as I said, we're humans and we all have that fundamental attribution error of thinking that we're a little bit healthier. So a good measure will help you to see yourself with grace, but also with growth. And so the Enneagram does that. And that's why I like it. That's why I continue to use it. And thankfully, a lot of people have come back to it. I know Lisa Turkhurst was on Ian Cron's podcast, which helps a lot. She's probably one of the top Christian leaders for women, and many others Christianity Today leaders use it. And so there's people who are saying, this is an elegant tool. Let's not throw it away, even if we don't like one person. I've heard others lastly say, let's have grace for that one person we don't like who used the Enneagram or maybe help to develop it. Like maybe he was having an off day, and many will even attack like he wasn't doing anything bad. For me, that's not as important as how I'm using it. And I'm using it ethically to help marriages.
I love how you talk about all truth is God's truth, because I agree with that. I think that is an accurate statement. And I think we often throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because just because someone used the Enneagram in one way doesn't mean that the people who are using it today are using it in the same way.
Right.
And so I'm all for, I was interviewing someone yesterday and they said, one thing I've picked up about your podcast is you talk a lot about self-awareness. And I guess guilty as charged. I mean, I do, because I think that is such a starting point, because we're always outwardly focused, but unless we kind of see what we're bringing to the party, we can really kind of be like a bulldog in a china shop. It's like we can mess things up just because we're lacking self-awareness. And I think we've all been there. I think this is something that we need to grow in on the daily, but I think the Enneagram is a tool for that. And so I appreciate how you answered that question, because I think if we just throw the baby out with the bathwater, then there's going to be a lot of people who think that maybe they're not going to have the tools through which to become self-aware. And I think that's the important thing here. It's the self-awareness. I'm more loyal to people being self-aware than I am to them using any particular personality inventory.
Right. If they want to do the growing.
That's it. And so I'm glad that you're doing this. I'm glad that you're leading people in this way. When you work with couples and you're talking to them about their Enneagram numbers, what are some of the hangups that people have?
Most of my couples come to me in a space of desperation. So they're
Mm,
not at all on that platform of like, and most of them are just like, I just want help for my marriage. Many of them are Christians, most of them, and not all, but most are. And they just want some help, and they want to walk through life with less stress together, with less dysregulation. They want to walk through life with less animosity. So when I offer them the chance to explore their temperaments through the Enneagram, they're usually like, absolutely, whatever you've got for me, I'm ready to start the work. And then when they do, they usually come to the session that we talk about their types with, of course, a bit of assessment to make sure they've got the right type, just a little bit of conversation around that. But also then once they do know that's their type, just the sense of, oh, I feel so known. And there's this sense of being understood and seen in a way they haven't. Sometimes there's even tears that go with that of never having been able to put words on who they are. And often the work that I can do in just one or two sessions to start us out can bring some hope that they desperately needed. Once in a great while, they don't even need any other sessions, but many times they do because they need to do some bigger, longer term work to build new systems and behaviors and habits. So for some people, the work is brief. Some people see me for years, but at each point, if they like the Enneagram, which most of them do, and find it helpful, it's nice to refer to that. In parts of our session, we don't do only Enneagram work, but we do refer to that in a lot of our work.
So when you start working with a client or a couple, what are a few things that you do initially with them?
Well, I now do more relationship coaching versus clinical assessing. I still have that hat a bit. So I still try to make sure that I'm looking at them as a whole person in sort of a biopsychosocial spiritual way to find
Yeah,
out how are they doing with fitness? How are they doing with faith? How are they doing with their job, their family? And what are their goals? Those are always my questions I start with is how are you doing and what are your goals? And usually they aren't doing very well. And that's why they've sought me out.
right.
And usually their goals are some sort of relationship healing. So depending on what it is, we often start to look at their shadow pieces by using the Enneagram to just say, okay, I'm so glad you let me know. And now we can look at who you are and what might be some roadblocks you didn't even know you had. So I look at the Enneagram and often their instinct patterns within the Enneagram too.
And so you mentioned the shadow pieces. And I've often heard people, philosophers or theologians, they'll talk about this idea of our shadow person that's always with us that oftentimes we don't want to look at. We don't want to even understand because we're trying to outrun our shadow person. And you can't outrun your shadow. Your
Yeah.
shadow will always be there.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
what does it look like for us as we are trying to understand those shadow pieces of our lives?
I think it's helpful to look at them. We could just say in general, everyone has shadows, as you mentioned. And a Jungian idea is that we all have this piece of us that sort of drags behind. We can't get rid of it. But what we can say with our Enneagram work or any good work we do together on ourselves is we can say, I'm aware of it now and I can watch out for it. And I can try to do some healing work around that. So each type has their own, what we call vice. Some people call it a passion, and then that would be their emotional shadow. And then we also have, each of us has our own sort of thinking shadow, these negative scripts we carry around called the fixations. And these are just two pieces of our shadows. But we can also have shadows when we're in a low state in our type or in our wings or arrows, as I mentioned. We can have shadows with our instincts. So there's lots of ways that humans can walk in our shadows. Actually, thankfully, there's a lot of ways we can walk in the higher parts of us too.
Well, and I think it's important too, as we talk about shadows, to also say that no matter what your Enneagram number is, if you're in a season of unhealth, you're going to be unhealthy. And so some people will be like, well, I'm staying away from that number because they're this or they're toxic. Well, that's not true. Every number can be toxic. Every number can be healthy.
Yes, absolutely.
And we all carry around those shadows. One of my friends says it like this. He says, well, we have to recognize that even the things we may not like about ourselves, they're still part of us. It's not the whole thing, but it's part of us.
Yeah.
And as we realize that it's part of us, then we get to decide, okay, now that I know it's there, do I want to give it the driver's seat, or do I just want to know that it's in the car? And, and I think
I love that.
That's the important aspect of kind of knowing ourselves through tools like this, because we don't have to get to this self-deprecating place where we're like, well, I'm an 8, so I'm just this, or I'm a 6, so I'm just this.
Yes.
No, there are great things that 6s can do, and then there are pitfalls. Same with every single number. I love how you unpack that for your clients, but also for us, because I think it's important to know that just because we have a shadow doesn't mean that we're entirely in the dark.
Yes. Oh, I love that you use that metaphor of light and darkness and shadows, because I also love the car analogy. I hear Myers-Briggs people use that a lot. And I really like that, because whatever works for the listener here will be helpful in terms of this picture of, yes, you have pieces that sometimes you use to try to get yourself in a particular healthier mindset, and they're quite maladaptive. But your goal is often regulation. It's usually that. Right. It's usually, if you're in a relationship, we're looking for regulation and some self-soothing. And when we're not as healthy, or we're in our shadow, we're tricking ourselves and taking the shortcut that is actually a detour and not a shortcut, unfortunately, and thinking that we're going to bypass the emotional processing or the healthy thinking or the healthy behaviors by taking this route. And instead it winds us up being farther away from where we wanted to go. So when you can see that, you don't hate your shadow pieces. You just understand, like you said, you see them, you notice, you can do sort of an internal family systems process if you want, and sort of put all the pieces inside of you and just say, okay, I have my 1 part that's a perfectionist. Sometimes I have my 2 part that's a giver. And sometimes I even do that exercise with my clients or myself. And I just watch, what are the different parts of me doing right now? And maybe I see that 7 running all over again, and I'm like, oh, I see what you're doing. But you can reach out for support and community. You're allowed to ask others for help. You're allowed to tell your husband what you're feeling, or whoever. And so it's important that we allow ourselves a bit of reflection as to why we're allowing that shadow to reign in our lives, and then give ourselves grace, but also a bit of the healthy guilt that says, I don't want to live like this. This is maladaptive. It's not good for my family or I. So now, instead of shame, I just have some healthy guilt and some happier motivations on the other side. If we can say, last time I took my time and I was thoughtful about how to walk through this difficult moment, I actually came out healthier than the last time I used my gluttony or avarice or whatever else they may have used in a bad way.
I like that. When you view it as, okay, so last time when I did this, I used this tool rather than the old trusty tool that I'd always use. You talk about it in terms of being maladaptive. Sometimes we grow up and that works for us in our family of origin. But then as we get older, we still try to use that tool, and it's that shadow piece. And it's never given us the thing that we wanted. And a lot of times those were during seasons where we were dysregulated, where we were just in survival mode. And then as we try to grow and heal and thrive, we have to use different tools. And I think life gives us the opportunity to do that, because when we're around other people who may have different personality types, they're able to see these things and say, yes, is what you're doing healthy? I don't think so. Like, let's talk about this.
Right. Our family's pretty good for that.
Yeah. And it's like having that person who can kind of look at you and say, I don't know you as you know you, but at the end of the day, that's not okay what you did. That's not okay what you said. And let's talk about it. And if you have those people in your life who they're gifts, they'll tell you straight, but they will also walk with you through it. They won't push you away. They won't make you feel like you are irredeemable, but they will pace with you, because you know what? Someone's probably done that with them. Because that's the thing. Regardless of our type, we are all in need. We have our strengths and weaknesses. We have our areas of polish, and then we have our areas where we're just totally jacked up. I mean, it's just,
it's true.
And that's part of being human.
Yep. It is. I love that you named how social you need to be in order to heal too, because we're not just social creatures, but we are. And so, had we been around someone who is shame based, we don't grow as much. But when we grow around somebody who has done their own work, like you said, they can hold a bit more space and compassion to say, okay, I remember what I felt like. Maybe it's not the same, but I know what it feels like to feel very stuck and you're not doing something healthy, but I still care about you and I still want to see you thrive, versus that person who's like, I can't believe you did that. And now you wish you never said it, you know?
And there are those people. And I think that's why it's important as we are building our inner circles and we are thinking through boundaries with people. And as we are growing in community, to find those people who are safe people who they may not be 100% healthy, but they have a desire to grow in health. I've found that to be a game changer in my life, because when I don't hang out with people who they may be well-meaning, but there's just no desire to grow in health. Well, then,
right.
Yeah, that's not good. And I've also found as you want to grow in health, there's almost this magnetism. And I don't know, maybe I'm saying something weird or controversial, but I feel like we draw people like us. Like wherever we are in life, we draw people to us. Is that a thing, or am I just making that up?
No, I think that's really a thing, because you want people who can track with you where you're at. And when you're mate seeking, you're looking for somebody who understands where you're at and you can understand where they're at. And so even when we're looking for friends, we do some of that leveling as well, because we're trying to understand. Now, if it's something like a ministry, we might say, you know what, I know that I'm approaching children or somebody who has very few skills because they're in a very vulnerable state. But if I'm looking for a person to support me and I can support, I need to find somebody who's tracking with me at about the same level. And so I don't do any kind of measures like that where I'm like, oh, this person's below me and above me. But I try to notice, whether somebody is becoming more of a true soul friend or somebody's becoming more of a person to minister to. And that might be a bit of both, but sometimes it might be, you know what, I just realized something. This person triggers me and they're not healthy for me to reveal myself to. So hopefully I can still bless them in some ways, but they're not going to be like a safe place person for me, which would be more of the friend category.
And I like how you said that. You broke it down into two categories, the soul friend versus someone that I could minister to, rather than just pushing people away, where sometimes we need to set those boundaries and set them hard. I get that. I think that's But again, boundaries are not walls. You can let people in and let people out with boundaries. With walls, you're just kind of trapped and you're isolated. And so you talk about this concept of a soul friend. Tell me a little bit more about that.
I think of a soul friend as somebody who can hear our deep wounding and still love us, who can hear our vulnerabilities and still love us, who knows our flaws and still loves us, but also who knows our gifts and who cheers us on and loves us there. Now, we're going to have conflict with those people sometimes because we're going to have a felt lack of compatibility on some things. So even just being able to understand that we all have our own wiring and our down to our genome. I mean, the epigenetics research is very young, but just realizing like even with soul friends, there's going to be things we disagree on. But what I've come to learn, and this is very hard for me as a type 7, once people start to know every personality type about on a deeper dive level, staying even when there's these discrepancies is very key. So I have a lot of people, even my own husband, who I have a lot of big differences from, and I've learned to stay and just be with them. And we still, like I said, to have that soul friend quality or spouse, obviously you're going to have a lot of spaces where you do agree and where you connect, but there has to be this respect and compassion for the places you don't, versus this huge piece of judgment and shaming, like, well, I did like them until I found out they supported this person and now I can't stand them anymore. Instead, you could more frame it as, and I'm going to say that because we're in 2024 now, but, just allowing yourself to show love for people who have a different viewpoint than you. And I just think that's going to go a long way this year and always.
Yeah, absolutely. I've found that several of my friends have very different viewpoints than I do. And if anything, it makes our friendship better, but there's just an acceptance. And sometimes there are things that we just don't talk about, but if we do talk about them, we're able to go in saying, okay, well, here's Raleigh's view, here's my view.
Mm-hmm.
But there might be some things we agree on. And so rather than viewing it as an us and them mentality, I'm looking at my friend who has different views as part of my us. It's like these are my people.
Yeah.
And I found that
Yes.
to be helpful because I think when we get super tribal about it, it can be it will just get very messy. And yeah, we're seeing that even in this year, it's an election year. I mean, this is a time where we define ourselves by what we believe and I do think it's important to have our political views. I think that's great. But I think at the end of the day, your best friend, your soul friends may be people who view the world differently than you. And I think that's okay too.
Me too. Yeah. I think it's nice to have healthy people on every different side if possible to say, hopefully we'll bring the best candidates to the table when we each have some thoughtful people on every side.
Absolutely. And so in these last moments, Christa, tell me, how would you encourage people who are in relationships to think through their Enneagram and how they interact with others?
Well, I like how you said think through their Enneagram. So we'll start there, that you first look to see if you want to take this test. But then once you do, to really allow yourself to read through materials on it. And there's plenty on the internet for free at my site and elsewhere to just look to see, was this the correct typology for you? And you just want to look at what are some of the core blessings and gifts or core wounds, both, to see, is this a fit? Does this sort of feel like somebody's reading my mail? And allow yourself to sit with several types, but ultimately to come back to one. And then once you do, to allow yourself to understand why that part of you that seems more maladaptive is acting the way it is. And just to look at yourself with grace and say, okay, I see that. Yeah, I do that. I avoid this emotion or this movement or whatever it is that is probably important and balanced for me, but I avoid it because... And you might have some stories about that in the past. And I would just remind you, if you do, to remember that every generation has stories from a never-ending chain. And so you want to be as gracious as you can to the generations that have gone before you, but also with the self-awareness that you're now in a generation where we're able to do some work. Like this podcast is here for us. Thank you, Raleigh. All these different spaces now that we can process together that maybe some of our ancestors certainly did not have. So just to be able to also say, I also celebrate the good and the fact that I'm in a time in life when I might be able to bring a major change to my generational patterns that have come before me. And then to really look and examine on a sort of baby step way, how can I do that? And that's always going to come back to healthy self-soothing, healthy self-regulation, so that you can make sure that you're getting body, mind, heart, soul care, just at the most basic level, so that you can put that oxygen mask on and help your partner, help the world in a way that is meaningful and not exhausting to you or going to get you right back in that old route. So that's just a general for everybody to watch for that and to make sure that you're mindful and grace-filled, but also moving forward.
Thank you for that. And thank you for being on the Mercy Cast.
Thank you for having me. This was great. These were wonderful, thoughtful questions. Thank you so much.